Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I would like to welcome everyone who is in the room right now and everyone watching us from home. I would also like to welcome Steve for being here today and holding this talk for us. One quick note, in case you have any questions during the talk, you can just write them on the online chat. We will answer them at the end. Or if anyone has questions here, I will go through with the microphone at the end, and then you can ask your questions to Steve directly. I wish you a great talk and good luck.
Thank you. Right, let me start the clock. Okay. No, that's better. Right, well, thank you for coming. I seem to have a habit of doing scary talks, and this is sort of a scary talk, but maybe with some stuff at the end that looks good. So my name is Steve Poole. I work now for a company called Sonotype, who do Maven Central and Nexus and stuff like that. So you've probably heard about them. You may even have used their software. What I care about are things like security and developer productivity and things like that. So I'm here to talk about some stuff. So I'm going to talk to you to start off with about why and how the world is getting harder for us as developers around cyber attacks and what's happening and all the bits and pieces behind that. Then I'm going to talk to you about the beginnings of some actions that are going to change how we deal with cyber attacks in a very positive way. But it has a bunch of consequences, and we'll talk about that too. So let's start with some scary bits. So one day, you go into work, as you do, unless you're remote, but I suppose you're still going to work. And you discover that you have some problems. Things don't work, files don't open, you get errors. It's like, this is not work good. And then maybe you get reports from your clients and your users going, things aren't working. I'm getting these strange error messages. You know, can't find things. Things are not working. So you start digging into it, and then you start finding these weird files with weird file suffixes. And these are just a few of them. There's not a URL if you want to read more of them. And you go, this is strange. What's going on? Maybe you got a clue. And you try and sign into some of these systems, and it says, no, you can't sign in, don't know why. Maybe do some digging. Maybe you find a file or two that looks like this, that starts to give you a hint of what's going on, because you've probably been the victim of a ransomware attack. Now, what I'm going to talk about isn't specifically about ransomware, but which is an exciting talk on its own. This is just a symptom. So if you've ever been the victim of a ransomware attack, it's a horrific thing to happen to human beings, let alone to computers, right? But basically, somebody's got into your system and has encrypted your data, okay? And somewhere there will be a link that says, send some money, Bitcoin or whatever, using cryptocurrency to some wallet, right? And if you do that, they'll give you back your data, right? It's a horrible place because your systems are now totally compromised. You know they're compromised, and you can do very little about it. Now, I'm going to talk about how that happens because that's relevant to this bigger conversation, so bear with me. What really happens with ransomware, more than anything, is it starts off with what we would call phishing. You get a nice little email, and it looks a really nice email, and you open it up, and inside that email is some payload, which you probably go, that's fine, I'll do that, that looks okay. And that payload will then install malware, it'll go back to the client, it'll go back to the cloud, it'll install stuff. Bad things will happen from then on. And it came in through some email, right? And you know this, it's this thing we're all taught all the time about worrying about the emails that we've come in because of the fact they may have some malware payload. However, now what happens is it's not the phishing type things that you may have heard about, the things that you've seen, the experiences that you may have seen in terms of getting one in your email, right? So I've got a couple of examples that came to me over the years. you know, and you can read the words. I can think of just about read the words, but you read the words and you go, that's just silly. Why would I fall for that? Okay, this was one from some guy in Nigeria. I've got a credit card with some money, you know, send me some money and I'll give you a credit card with millions on it. And it's like, yeah, we've seen that one. Ditto, things like this. Well, you get, I love this one, I love this because of the wording. This one says from the FBI saying, hey, you're owed some money because some bad guys, and I have to squint to read this, said, where is it? Yeah, it says, due to corrupt government officials who almost held the fund to themselves for their selfish reason. And you look at it and you go, yeah, it's just one of those fishes, right? You just ignore it. But occasionally you might get something like this. Something really terse, something very specific, something that you would go, oh, I'm not sure. Because it may be very obvious, it may be from your boss. It might say, this company that you've already know about, that you're dealing with, and there's something you need to do. And if you are not comfortable with saying no to your boss because you're not sure, you're going to do it anyway, right? And those sorts of things are the ways that malware gets in. And you get things like this. So this is a really, you can see the example, but this is an example where malware was introduced because the bad guys had looked very carefully at how a particular company worked, knew the process, knew the industry, and sent them some malware. In this case, it was a waybill. And basically, it says you must open this and deal with it. So you imagine logistics people at freight shop stops, at ports, very busy. Something comes in, they're used to. It's all got all the right language. They do that. This one has a zip file. They look at it, install malware, right? What I'm trying to get to is that the phishing that you have experienced in the past, which were aimed at trying to find people who weren't particularly clever and gullible, but were quite gullible, is not the only type of stuff that you can get. Ransomware is aimed at specific types of organization. And bear with me, we'll explain why this is important to the conversation. But ransomware is targeting particular types of organization, whether you be hospitals or technology places, whether you be finance, manufacturing, they're being crafted to your business. Even worse, they're being crafted to your business. And the reason they're being crafted to your business is because you're part of a supply chain. And I'll get on to that in a minute. So what's going on now is that the world is moving away from the types of phishing and attacks that you've seen before, which are pretty random, pretty generic, towards very specific targeted attacks based on your company, based on the way that your company works, right? And they do that by engineering, social engineering you through phishing, but also they go watch you. So if I can find out that you work for a particular company, I can look at what you say on Facebook or Meta or whatever it's called now, you know. And if you say there, I don't like my boss, then maybe you'll get something that's crafted, as I said before, right? It's all about trying to get in. Okay, it's not the only way in. The other way that the bad guys get in. So in this case, we're talking about ransomware. We're going to get into the system, do bad things to it. So phishing is really cool. The other way is to find vulnerabilities in the networking tools that you use, the distribution systems. You think about how you get software delivered, where it comes from. You think about maybe you've bought some of the distribution systems yourself. Maybe you've got mobile phones for your engineers and you have delivery systems. Those are all targets because they're a great way to get malware in and distributed. Right. And this is the next scary bit. Not only are they trying to use the systems that you already used to deliver software, they're also attacking those systems by going what they call upstream, looking for places in the supply chain where they can add malware. And you may have seen a few instances where things have been properly signed by some company. And if they can make that happen, then that software gets trusted because it was signed by some person further up the supply chain. They want to get in there and use those things. At the end of the day, all this is about getting to this. Almost all our cyber attacks end up with, can I get to the point where I can run a command on your systems? Okay, that's what they're trying. Remote code execution, RCEs. So cool. So they get into your system, and then the malware makes some calls back because it's going to get some encryption keys because this is ransomware. It's going to get, and there's no point randomly encrypting. It's going to be controlled. And then it's going to use some pretty sophisticated techniques to encrypt your system. You're not going to see it happen. It could take place over days because there are some really cool techniques to work out which of the system files you're using are least used. Can I encrypt those first? And there's a whole bunch of in-memory game techniques. So basically, very sophisticated ways to get to the point where you've encrypted your system. Okay. And then they're also trying to steal your data because while they don't really need to because they're encrypting it, actually they would like to steal your data because that's valuable. And they're very sophisticated. Some of these attacks will find weaknesses in the protocols that you use. They will figure out how to insert payloads. They'll have botnets making reasonable calls to your application server, but which is being compromised, and so bad data is being flowed out. It's being pulled out. It's really quite scary how often people get attacked and lose their data, and they have no idea how the data escaped. And it can be sophisticated techniques like this, or it can just be really simple FTP, but then they go and break the logs or hack the logs and you can't see. So loads of ways, okay? So you may go, well, I've heard about ransomware, right? It's something that happens and, you pay it off. Maybe it's the cost of business. But there is an underlying punchline that's new. And that is ransomware isn't necessarily what you think. Ransomware isn't necessarily making money, though it's always good if it does. Ransomware is a demonstration of an attack methodology. Think about that. If I want to attack your system, how would I know that I've done it successfully? Well, if I attack your system using these sorts of technologies, I can get into your system, I can insert code, I can insert data, I can encrypt your data, and you pay up, then I know I was successful. And the reason this is happening is because cyber attacks are moving from being purely commercial to being a new stage, which is about cyber warfare. You will have seen it occasionally, where there will be some bad actor, there'll be some moaning about some group in Korea or Russia that's being funded by the state, allegedly funded, to attack you. And now what's people are beginning to understand that this is the next battlefield. Because you think about the consequences of ransomware on, say, a hospital. As it closes it down, it has bad effects. People might die, right? But you imagine that in the scenario of a warfare, right? We're going to attack you, so let's close down your systems. Let's disrupt your infrastructure. So what they're trying to do is get into your systems and stay there. So the ransomware quite often can be seen as just a demonstration that the process that they built actually works. But they may attack a bunch of people and not do any ransomware attacks at all. They just know that they're in the system as they need to be. Because what do they want to do? They want to turn off your system. They want to compromise it. They might want to add bad data. They might want to add new IDs. There's all sorts of things they're going to do, right? And it's a different motivation. And it's really valuable. So if you've seen any of my other cybercrime talks, you may have seen a chart like this. I think this is really valuable. So I'm going to show you the scale. The red line is cybercrime, what we're talking about, and the green line is the drug trade, right? The illicit drug trade. And this is what it's been. The green line, the drug trade, is physical. It's manageable. It's still pretty big. It's $450 odd billion. And it's been like that for years and years and years, right? It's controllable because you can see drugs, you can touch drugs. Cybercrime has gone through the roof, right? This year, $6 trillion was the prediction. Okay? $6 trillion. You think about all the money we spend to deal with the drugs trade, and that's a fraction compared to $6 trillion, right? And it sounds, okay, that's really bad. Well, it's even worse than that, okay? $6 trillion, that top of the line, that turns out to be just the ransomware stuff we were talking about, right? But there are estimates that actually there's another $30 trillion worth of value in all the other ways that cybercrime can be used, right? So if you add that up and divide it by the number of adults in the world, that's $175,000. Every single one of these people in this room or on the call, $175,000. That's how much it's worth. Now, that's not coming out of your pay packet because, you know, not all of us earn 175,000, but it's the cost to the people you work for. It's the cost to the people they work for. It's an enormous amount of money. And you can see, you know, the benefits here. So what we're in now is this new world. Cybercrime has moved from being a significant nuisance to now a process for setting up war. It's a precursor. So everybody's trying to get themselves in a situation where they can insert their control into somebody else's system. And you can imagine everybody will want to do this. Right? And as such, we're moving away from having the bad guys be well educated into how to do this to being professional attackers. And you would have seen, if you scour the internet, some of these names come up. There are several groups that are well known who do this. Regularly exercised, very sophisticated, extremely lucrative. Can I? Yes. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. Right. So weaponized cybercrime is the new frontier for us. And it's happening now, and it's getting worse. And unfortunately, because it's all software, the target for many of these things, and believe me, what we've seen is just the beginnings of these sorts of attacks, is open source. Because 90% of most modern applications, the dependencies you use are open source. Right? We use open source all the time because it gives us an incredible advantage to create good stuff. Right? And the amount out there is horrific. You know, it just grows and grows and grows. Right? 3 million projects, 37 million versions, 2.2 trillion downloads. That's just from the 4 top ecosystems. It's an enormous amount of software that we rely on, which is all open source. And our relationship with our open source projects is all based on trust. We all trust that those people, they may be neutral in their effect towards us, but we don't expect them to be nefarious, trying to break our systems. Right? And we trust it so much that it's growing. Year by year, it's like 73%-ish growth year by year. That's how much we keep creating and consuming. Right? So by the end of 2025, we're looking at 20 trillion downloads of software. That's just incredible. Right? And so what the bad guys are doing, they're not doing what they used to. Well, they're still doing what they used to, but they do more things. What they used to do was go and wait for vulnerabilities to be discovered in software. They're not waiting any longer. Now they make their own. And there are a whole bunch of ways that they make these attacks. These are just a few of them. So typo squatting, dependency confusion, that's all about getting into the repos and having replacement versions of software that have maybe the name slightly different, maybe the version is slightly different, But there are lots of ways for them to get to the point where when you try and use a piece of software and you do, I don't know, Maven build or whatever, Maven compile, then you get some downloads. You have put something in your dependency file and you spelt it wrong, or you put the wrong version number in, and the system goes off to Maven Central and it doesn't pull down what you thought, it doesn't give you an error, it pulls down something that's got a bad payload. If you have private dependencies, you have your own private code that you don't let out into open source, but you may have inadvertently let the names of those things out. Bad guys can register packages using the name, your internal package name, externally, and then when the system starts scanning and they start going, I need to go and get package foo, which you might have thought was internal, well, now there's a package foo externally, and that gets chosen over your internal one. So that sort of thing is going on all the time. The node space is notorious for it because they have much less control. Maven space is a lot safer, but it's still possible. They're going straight to open source repos. There's a whole bunch of social engineering going on, which is about how can I convince that open source project to take my bad code. And we could talk about that, all sorts of things. And they're going to the build systems. They're going for the tools. So it isn't just about finding vulnerabilities in the dependencies. It's also about, can I get into the compilers? Can I get into the utilities? Can I insert malware into those things? And these are active searches, and this is what they're trying to do. So what it means is those dependencies that you rely on, whereas before, people were just waiting for a vulnerability to turn up, well, now they're adding their own. They're looking at all the places in the software stack that you rely on to find weaknesses and add their own weaknesses. Right? And it's not like we had before where they were published. There's a vulnerability, you could go get a vulnerability scanner or find it. These are deliberately hidden, right? To go off at some time in the future in the event of some sort of war. So right now, the trust that we have in open source is beginning to evaporate. Now, it may not have hit you yet. This may not have reached you. You may not have internalized this, but we are at that stage now where our dependency on open source software is being compromised because we trust it and that trust is disappearing. So 5% of all the Java code that's on Maven Central, 5% already has very high severities. Right? So you've got that already. So the code that you download may already be compromised because it's got a vulnerability. But now there are these active attacks going on designed to get into the tooling and the supply chain that you're using in a quiet way. Okay? It's incredibly scary. And so Sonatype do this supply chain report every year, which you may have seen. And this year, the number of attacks on the supply chain, all the bits and pieces that we talked, like dependency confusion, typo squatting, and a bunch of others, which get tracked, the numbers have just gone through the roof. We've reached that tipping point. It has now become the most important way for state nations to position themselves for the future. It's all through software. Yeah. Okay, so that's the bad news. Let's talk about the good news. So, because it's become so bad, finally, in May, something happened. Well, what the US President Joe Biden did was to make an announcement about, well, basically said, let's fix this. Right? And he made an executive order, as presidents do, some things like, okay, so let's recognize that this is actually happening. Let's recognize that and agree and understand that it isn't organized crime that's doing this. It's state nations and organized crime and 15-year-olds in the bedroom, but everybody's doing this. And the way the governments work is to pass laws and bring people together, create incentives to fix the problem. So the biggest incentive is that eventually, as you'll see, the software that you provide has to if it's going to go to the US government, has to pass a whole bunch of new checks. Okay. So what they've said is, well, you have to have a thing called an SBOM. That's it's a software bill of materials, and I'll talk about that in a sec. But look at the other things that I'm saying that they're saying. An automatic supply chain process. No manual intervention between source code and release. I bet a lot of people have manual intervention between source code and release. Right? Evidence. The word evidence comes up a lot. Show me that you have evidence of software integrity, that your software wasn't compromised, right? That you have regular audit processes, right? That you have vulnerability check processes, right? That it happens all the time. You've got the tools running, and you're dealing with the results, right? And you show that you're doing the right thing, and this isn't just an audit, it's going to be digital evidence that shows that you are safe, or as safe as you can be. Okay. Now the SBOM turns out to be a couple of specifications. Both of these are valid. One's called CycloneDX, one's called SPDX. CycloneDX is an XML-based spec. Basically, if you imagine it as literally a recipe of all the things that you used, and theoretically everything that they used, everything they used, and everything they used. Now you can do the XML version with CycloneDX, or you can do SPDX, which is the one which you may have seen in terms of there was this licensing in terms of identifying particular types of license. SPDX is a format that's being expanded. Both of these are valid, and both of these will get used because somebody will pick one and somebody will pick the other, so you have to deal with both. This is actually going to be good, but it is going to have consequences. So the good thing is that it means we'll have better understanding of the software that we are using and how it was constructed. Nowadays, if you want to find that you've got vulnerabilities in the code that you're running, you get a vulnerability scanner, right? Loads of those, right? And it scans on everything, right? It tries to figure out after the fact what you use to build your product, what you've got, what dependency you've got, right? And it tries to work that through, right? And that means that within your code, then it must be transparent that you're using this version of X and this version of Y. But if that gets hidden, the dependency tool can't track it, right? So there are circumstances where that relationship may get hidden, especially about things like what tools do you use to compile your application? Well, that doesn't go in your dependency tree, does it? So the fact that there may be vulnerability in the compiler would never show up in a dependency scan because it doesn't look at those things. Right? So effectively, it's second best. It's looking at what you've got, trying to figure out whether you have versions of something that have vulnerabilities, and of course that could all be spoofed and faked, and that's what the bad guys do. What an SBOM does is it's flipped it on its head, and it says there is a definite evidence chain that says here's what I use to build my piece of software, right? From what version of operating system I ran on, what tools I use, what dependencies I've got, right? It's possible to construct that. Now that doesn't mean that you're going to build one of those and carry it around. You're going to build one that basically has links to somebody else's chain that you can prove is a valid link, etc., etc. So that you can say, I use this version of this compiler with a digital signature, not any version, because versions can be spoofed. And then you should be able to find out what that SBOM was, and so on. Okay, so that means that we're going to move from this model of basic, I have my thing, and I use some dependencies of certain version numbers, to something a bit more sophisticated. So there'll be URLs, there'll be digital signatures, etc., right? And everything will be in there. Now, none of this exists right now, but this is where we're going. So you're going to have your product, the way you built it, what compilers you use, what operating systems you use. It's all part of the process of demonstrating that you're producing safer software. Right? And since you inherit the things that your dependencies and tools use, so you end up with this big picture, that's really cool because you know everything. So that means if there any part of the supply chain that you relied on to create your software gets compromised, it's possible to find it because we can look at the whole list of things you used and go, yes, that thing has a problem. The downside is that there's going to be more of them because now we know exactly what you used, right? And we know exactly that you used this compiler, and we know exactly that compiler was built using this dependency, and we know that dependency was built using this compiler, etc., etc. And there was a problem. So this has fundamentally this big challenge for us, which is how are we going to do software in this world? Now, the US government set this off. The UK government said, yeah, we're following. Everybody's going to do this because it's quite straightforward. It's definitely good for governments. It's how they operate. We'll set standards, legislate against these things. Hey, guys, you go fix it. Right? Now, exactly what's going to go into this thing, under what timescales, that will just evolve. But you can see where this is going, right? And it isn't just about you going, oh, I don't need to do that because I'm not selling to the US government. All you need is to be in a supply chain of somebody else who's selling to the US government, and they're going to come to you and say, you've got to do this. So it's going to, over the few years, it's going to fan out until everybody is going to be impacted with this problem of providing evidence that you're creating your software safely and with enough evidence so that if things are wrong with it, they can be discovered more easily. 2025 is apparently when they think it'll get to the point where you will not be allowed not to do this. Now, if you think about the consequences of more information and this idea that you need to be more rigorous in how you do things, it impacts how you create software. Right? So you need to be able to go from nothing to the thing that you used to create it. And you're going to have more of these things coming along. You're going to get told more often there are problems. So you imagine you're part of a supply chain and there's a bug there's a vulnerability in your piece of software. There are all these people at the supply chain who are waiting on you to fix it. You can imagine the pressure that goes on for you to fix it and get it to happen. And bearing what I said about this idea that you can't create software, you have to create software automatically, that means us moving towards development pipelines where source to release is automatic and as fast as we can make it because we're now into that new sort of world. So many people use infrastructure as code as a way of creating things programmatically, systems and build systems and whatever. You can see this is going to move to being everything as code. It will become more and more necessary for us to go from having no human interaction from you committing the source code to the build happening to the release happening. So that has more consequences because you're choosing source code. You're choosing 90% of your application is using source code. You are now a consumer in part of this supply chain. You have now got to make some decisions of your own. What do you do if a piece of open source that you rely on says, we're not going to follow these rules, we're not doing this? Which is entirely their right. Okay? How much are you willing to risk that situation? How are you going to finesse that? And even if they do say yes, oh yeah, we'll do that, how do you know that you can trust them? Because trust in open source is now moving from the default of course I trust them, to the default of course I don't trust them until I can show that I am comfortable with consuming that software. So do they have an SBOM, right? Do they tell you how they produce software? You know, there's a whole bunch of things that suddenly is important to you about the open source project, not just whether it does what you want. You know, is it a left pad piece of software? Great, but does it fulfill a whole bunch of new rules? So part of this was to say, what tools can you use? So bad guys are getting more sophisticated. there's this need to start looking at producing more things more automatically. You don't want to do this by hand. Well, there are many tools. You can go to GitHub and you can go through the marketplace and you can go, hey, what tools have you got for code quality or code reviews? And you get numbers, right? There's lots and lots of that. And if you want to deal with vulnerabilities, of course, there are lots of people providing tools that will scan your vulnerabilities. Now, just because there's a tool that says they can do it doesn't mean that it does it. Remember, you're in zero trust mode. How do they? You've got to prove this, and you've got to look at it. So, for instance, vulnerability scanning, it's a really lucrative business. But the information that is used to detect whether you have vulnerabilities, there's multiple sources. There's quite a big public source, and then quite a few companies have their own research teams. So you may use this company and you'll get the public one and a bit more, or you use this company, you get the public one and a lot more, right? Maybe you have to use more than one. But you have to start thinking about, what am I getting? Am I getting what I need? Right? And even if you chose the best software in the world, which is not necessarily this one, it just happens to be what my company produces, the problem you have with this is it's early days. Right? So it turns out, this is not the best answer, but it turns out these are the 3 best things that you can use to help get yourself out of this hole, right? Your brain, your eyes, and your nose. And your nose, right? Why? Because the tools aren't there yet, right? And anyway, you need to start educating yourself into how you should be thinking about this. Right? You should be going back to your company and going, why do we use this stuff? How do we know that it's any good? Right? How do I know that? I may use some piece of open source project. Have you ever checked to see if it got compromised? Have you ever looked? You know, do you have? So what you've got to start doing now is building your suspicious muscles. You've got to look closely at the projects you're using. So Sonatype produced, I told you we produced this supply chain report. And there's some cool stuff in there about thinking about this. So these are just some of the selection criteria that Sonatype have come up with. Obviously, you do what you need to do, but now you've got to start thinking about that. What are the things that I should be checking for when I consume open source software? So, the license. How many people here, the small number of you, who have downloaded software have checked the license? Yes? Okay. How many of you checked the license of the dependencies that dependency downloads? Or less hands. Okay. Cool, that's good. Okay. Have you checked the provenance of that open source? Yeah. Look, see, there's some really good examples. Right. But it's very rare. The license thing is, okay, I'll do the thing that I'll look, it's a Apache license, that's okay. Yeah, but that Apache license for that thing, okay, well, it's only used a bunch of GPL stuff, but, oh, what the hell, right? But provenance, go check the open source project, right? Do they have a vulnerability reporting process? Looking for signs that these guys, these open source projects that you're relying on, are doing the right thing. Do they have a vulnerability reporting process? Do they tell you how they do, how you should report it? Especially don't report it in public. You know, here's the back channel that you should use. Right? Do they have a process that they can describe to you about how they review PRs? It doesn't mean they have to have lots of words, but at least to show that they thought about it. Right? And build processes. It turns out lots of open source projects have build processes. We all do, GitHub Actions or whatever. Quite a few of them have no controls over who kicks it off. So if somebody can get some bad code in, however they can get it, they can kick your build process off and release a new piece of software. Well, that wouldn't be good, would it? Okay. And can you assess their attitude to quality? Because the more that they think about quality, the more they're likely to be looking at bad things happening, thinking about the consequences of the code they write. Right. Now, none of this is great because we're asking open source projects to do things that up until now we've gone, we don't really care what you do as long as you give us function. But now it's becoming important to start looking at open source projects about how they produce the software, not just what it does. So other things. Unexpected release frequency. This is cool. So look at the release dots that they put out. Is the last one, if you had 2 or 3 in a row, you know, .1, .2, .3, maybe that's not a good sign of quality. Or maybe it's a sign of somebody's inserted some malware. You have to start thinking defensively. And what is going on? Do they do this often? You know, maybe they do ... because they're not very good at keeping the quality up. If they're not very good at keeping the quality up, then maybe they're taking contributions that aren't necessarily well founded. That's not necessarily a good sign. Okay. What do the committers do? Do you have 1 committer? Do you have 1,000 committers? Is there any sort of pattern? How do they talk to each other? Do you get a sense that these guys are for real? Are there certain committers turning up? You know, you have to look at these things. And I say, it is really hard. But these are the things that we're going to have to do in the future. Okay? Are they prone to breaking changes? Are they an open source project? You know that if they do the next dot release, something's going to break. Right? That's not good attitude either, is it? Right? And it's all this sort of like, do they care that they're part of the supply chain? You would worry about them breaking your APIs all the time anyway. But again, it's a sign of, can I rely on these people? And do they often have no path forward? So no path forward means you're in a situation where you have a vulnerability and there is no fix for it. There is no current version. You are broken because you need to have this fixed, but there is no outcome. Right? And if that happens on a regular basis, again, they're not taking your safety seriously. Okay. So this is obviously really hard for us to do it for our stuff, right? You're now being asked to change the way that you produce software, or you will be being asked to change the way you produce software. It's going to have consequences, but every single piece of software in your supply chain is going to go through the same angst. It's not very tenable. It's got consequences. So there are some obvious thoughts for me when I look at this. Okay, this is some of the consequences. So we can say that everything has to be automated because we're going to have all this information coming through about we've got things to deal with. And bear in mind, we're talking about weaponized malware. That's not going to be something you encounter all the time, but it's going to happen. Right? It's a new way of thinking about this. So you need to be going, what can I do to have a really fast, productive pipeline? Right? So that means your productivity is going to go down, possibly quite considerably as you start thinking about all the things. Right? And that's a consequence. And your ability to just take open source off the shelf is going to change because now you're going to start thinking about whether you can or can't. Your companies, who will probably have a whole bunch of policies in place already about what you can and can't do, are suddenly going to start waking up to, well, we've got a whole bunch of other rules to apply. So it's going to get harder and harder and harder to choose open source in terms of just going to an open source project and downloading stuff. So my expectation is that we'll start to see people getting in part of this process. You'll start to look at other people providing the services that the open source projects need, which can't do for themselves. So you can expect to be in situations where you'll be almost like catalogs of open source that you can choose from that are being maintained or at the very least monitored by companies to give you the safety factor that you need, right? And the pipelines that you build yourself, well, they're part of the supply chain and they have to be secure and they have to do all this stuff. And you can imagine that what's going to happen is that's going to become less and less of value. And you can imagine that more and more of these things will become things that you buy. Who wants to build their own pipeline if you can, if you're building a Jenkins pipeline and it's all open source and it does what you want, that's great. But if you're told to secure it, start putting extra checks in, you may get to the point where you go, it's just not worth it. And if somebody's doing it for you, then you might start moving that way. And you can expect to see more of these things turn up as people understand the benefits of these. Right? Those companies that can get where this is going are going to have immediate advantage because they are going to be able to sell software to people, to the governments, ahead of somebody else. Now, as I said, we're right at the beginning of this. This isn't, it's almost like the racing cars haven't actually left the grid because we've only just said this is what we want to do. And there's a whole bunch of detail about how quickly we can do this and in what direction. But you can see where this is going, right? And we're doing this not because we want to, but we're doing this because we're in a new world. We have people trying to use our software against us, which is a really scary thought, right? You're more likely to be attacked because of that than a drive-by. So drive-by is just generally you left the door open, you got attacked. Now, if you're part of a supply chain to somebody else, if you're part of the supply chain to a hospital, you're part of the supply chain to a military organization, you're part of the supply chain to your local supermarket, then getting into your systems could be lucrative and obviously is a control point if and ever it was needed. So suddenly you might be at risk in ways that you were never at risk before. And open source is still the way this is all going in because that's where we have invested all our time and effort into consuming open source projects, creating open source projects, supporting them. We could not be where we are without that happening, right? So somehow those open source projects have got to transform from what they are today to being something else. It's a long road, and you can see the sorts of things they need to do. I said, I don't expect, many of them will not want to do that. Many of them will not want to get involved in this, and you can imagine that there'll be circumstances where we'll start to have software that is part of a supply chain and software that isn't, and those sorts of things will start to come out over time. Okay. It's all software, right? So we, as developers, have just as much skin in this as our companies do because we create software. If you're contributing to an open source project now, start thinking about what are your dependencies? What could we do better? Are we safe enough? Are we doing the right thing? So, takeaways. The way that you choose open source projects is going to change. It's going to move from you just using it because it does the thing you want it to do to a whole bunch of other reasons why you will or will not choose it. Okay? And this idea of evidence, of audit trails, is going to become something we're also going to get used to. And it's very much like when GDPR came out. You remember there was lots of pain and angst and people said, we can't do this, it's just unfair. And what actually happened was specific companies would stand up and say, we'll deal with it for you. You buy our service and we'll deal with it for you. If you're a large company, do it yourself. If you're a small company, find somebody who does it for you. This is what's going to happen here. We're going to find more and more of the services we want to use are going to come from some commercial entity. Might give it away for free, but you can see that the old world of open source, free-for-all, total trust is slowly going to transform into something completely different. Right? It's also time to start thinking about whether all you want is a ticky mark that says, I have protection, I bought this company's solution and it's a tick, it does what I want, does it actually do what I want? Do I have the protection I need? Does the antivirus system that I use on my machines, does it actually do what it says? Have you tested it? Have you proven it? And that's the attitude that we're slowly going to get towards, because we have new bad guys and they're really after our software. Thank you. Any questions? Anybody? No? Okay.
Perfect. So we have one question
Yes.
in the chat. Yeah. Okay, so we have one question in the chat, and someone is asking, should ransom payments be banned by the state?
Well, the advice is don't pay them, because so I don't know whether they should be banned, but if you do pay them, the very least you've done is you've helped fund them attack you next time. And quite often, ransomware is quite sophisticated. So even if you do pay them, you may only get a partial piece of your data back, and then you'll discover there's another layer of double encrypted data, and they want more money from you. So I don't know, I think it's a political thing about whether it should be banned or not. But all we see is basically if you pay them off, there's no guarantee that you're going to be any better, and you'd give them a whole bunch of money, right? But I would say, have a thought about what would happen if your system was, if ransomware was applied to your system today. When was the last time that you, A, took backups of your system, and B, proved those backups were still valid? When was the last time you did a disaster recovery exercise? Because I bet a lot of you, it's been a long time, and the ransomware guys are quite good at getting into your backups. So even if you do recover it, you just recover encrypted data. That's cool? Yeah? Okay, well, thank you. So if you want more about the supply chain, there's a whole bunch of more information in there. It's a free document. There's some cool data. I will be around all day tomorrow. And if you can find me. Otherwise, pop by the Sonotype office and stand and ask for me, and they'll find me. It's a scary world, but hopefully we can make it better. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you from our side too. And thank you to everyone who was present here and also online again. And I wish you a great evening. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.